In this video, we're going to talk about the long-run equilibrium of the economy. And so here is a graph that's showing you the long-run equilibrium of the economy where the aggregate demand crosses the long-run aggregate supply curve. And we can call that point A. Okay. When the economy reaches its long-run equilibrium, the expected price level will have adjusted to equal the actual price level. So at this point, the expected price level equals the actual price level. So there have been adjustments in the expectation of the price level. And as a result, the short-run aggregate supply curve also crosses this point as well. Okay, so you're going to always have the three curves intersect at a point, and that is going to be the long-run equilibrium. Now, when we talk about economic fluctuations, which is the interesting part that we're getting to, which we will analyze in the context of this aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve model, we have 4 steps in analyzing macroeconomic fluctuations in the short run. The first step is that you want to decide whether an event in the economy shifts the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve, or perhaps both. Okay, so we'll take an example of that as well. So you'll see how that works. The second thing you want to decide is what is the direction of the curve, of the shift of the curve. So is it shifting right, left, up or down, and things like that. Okay, so very similar to what you have seen in chapter 4. The third thing you want to do is to use the diagram of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to determine the impact on output and price level in the short run. So you want to think about the short run equilibrium. And then lastly, you want to use the diagram of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to analyze how the economy moves from the short run equilibrium to the long run equilibrium. So the first 2 steps should be pretty straightforward, and I would, if I were you, I would rely a lot on my intuition to understand what's going on with demand or supply. Okay, but when you get to the next 2 things, you want to follow along the lecture so you know what to do on the test, for example. Okay, so let's talk about an event which is going to cause a recession. Okay, and let's talk about maybe a couple of events that can cause a recession. There could be a stock market crash. There could be a housing market crash. There could be an outbreak of war, or there could be some kind of a scandal in the White House. So anything that breaks the confidence that customers have or consumers have, and they lose confidence in their future plans, and they would alter their plans. So typically when there's a wave of pessimism in the economy, households would cut back on their spending and delay their major purchases, and firms would also put off buying new equipment or hiring workers. Okay, so we want to understand what would that do. So one thing you might think about is that this is an effect on demand, right? So if there's a stock market crash, you might lose your retirement savings or your investment savings, and your investment accounts may not look good for a while. And that is sort of like a wealth shock to you, right? So consumption can fall, investment can fall, and things like that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to think about that first step. So which curve is going to shift? Okay, so in this case, the event is going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift, and you want to figure out what is the direction of the shift. Okay, now if this is a crash, right, the aggregate demand in general should fall, and that would be reflected in a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so fall in aggregate demand is represented with a leftward shift. So I'm going to call this AD1 and this is AD2. Okay, and we can also label this to represent, so let's call this here P1. P1. Okay, so we were at P1 and I'm going to call this Y1. Okay, so I'm going to remove this for now and I'm going to call this Y1. So let's say this was our initial equilibrium at point A. This is point A. Okay, and now what has happened is we've moved to a point B in the short run. Okay, so we were at point A. At point A, the coordinates were, this was initial equilibrium. So this is initial equilibrium. At point A, the coordinates were Y1 and P1. Okay, and now we've moved to a point B, which is our short run equilibrium. At point B, the output is lower. We're at Y2 and prices are also lower at P2. So we are at Y2, P2. So in the short run, the economy has moved from point A to point B. Output has fallen from Y1 to Y2 and the price level has fallen from P1 to P2. Now, over time, as the expected price level adjusts, the short run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right from AS1 to AS2. So we can draw this here. Okay. And it is going to end up here. So short run aggregate supply curve 1 to short run aggregate supply curve 2. So this is the shift. Okay. This is basically people trying to adjust their expectation of the price level. So when there's pessimism, prices are expected to fall. This had happened very quickly when we moved to point B, but over time people are thinking that yes, the economy is bad and they would reach a point like point C right here. This is point C, and point C is where the new aggregate demand curve, right, AD2, crosses the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so in the long run, the price level would fall to P3 and we would come back to the natural level of output, which was YN. So in the long run, we would return to point C, at which we are back to Y1 and prices are a lot lower than before. Now, remember that policymakers can always try to change aggregate demand and they can shift aggregate demand curve in a way to bring back the price level as well. So we'll look at that in the next video. A policymaker's response when we end up at a point like point B where output is lower than its natural level, so we actually have a recession here. We are not producing, right? Y2 is less than Y1. We're not producing at our natural level, and so unemployment is higher than its natural rate. We are at point B. Aggregate demand curve can shift back to AD2, can go back to AD1 if there was an increase in government spending or a cut in taxes. So this is sort of the fiscal response. This is expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary refers to a policy that would expand the output. So expansionary fiscal policy would would be something like this, where the government spends money or it cuts taxes in order to stimulate demand, or aggregate demand can be stimulated by expansionary monetary policy. This could be done by an increase in money supply, which is really a decrease, which causes a decrease in the interest rate. And when the interest rate falls, investment increases, and that would increase Y. So you would move from a point, you would move the aggregate demand curve back to point A from B if there was an expansionary type of policy.